security.
Boeing has told airlines using its 787 Dreamliners that pilots need to check their seats after a sudden mid-air dive injured more than 50 people. The loss of altitude by the LATAM Airlines plane is reported to have been caused by a flight attendant accidentally hitting a switch on the pilot's seat. It pushed the pilot into the controls, forcing down the aircraft's nose. A top-flight women's football match in Britain was delayed by 30 minutes on Friday due to a sock mix-up. Arsenal turned up wearing white socks, clashing with Chelsea's home kit. The Gunners had to buy black socks from the Chelsea on-site megastore. Chelsea beat Arsenal 3-1 in front of 33,000 fans. BBC News.
तुम्ही ऐकताय द फिफ्थ फ्लोअर फर्नाक अमिदीसह पुढचा कार्यक्रमही नक्की ऐका.
Thank you, Janavi Moulay from BBC Marathi, for opening up today's Fifth Floor. It's the place where we look at the world's news through the eyes of the BBC's many different language services. I'm your host, Faranaik Amidi, and we start today in Israel, where the war in Gaza has reignited the long-standing dispute over who should serve in the army. Historically, ultra-Orthodox Jews have been exempt from military service to pursue their religious studies. But many in Israel say this is unfair, including the Supreme Court. Recently, those supporting the exemption, as well as those wanting it to end, have been out on the streets protesting because the exemption is set to expire at the end of the month. BBC Arabic's Michael Shubal has been covering the story.
So the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel consists of many different streams. They're considered far more conservative than mainstream Jews. Now, the separation between some ultra-Orthodox communities and the rest of the country begins at a very early age, when the children are sent to religious schools where boys and girls study separately. Public schools are funded by the state, and they must teach certain subjects like math, English, science. Ultra-Orthodox schools teach Torah, Bible, and other religious texts. Many don't teach the so-called secular classes, but still enjoy state funding. Now, the separation continues after high school graduation, when Israeli graduates are drafted to the army. Men are required to complete 3 years of military service, and women serve for 2. At the same age, most ultra-Orthodox men receive an exemption and carry on with their studies in religious seminaries or yeshivas. There are some ultra-Orthodox men who take advantage of the exemption, but who need it.
So tell us about the history of this exemption. Why were they exempted in the beginning?
When Israel was founded in 1948, the Jewish leader at the time, David Ben-Gurion, needed a wide national consensus in order to vote for statehood. And he wanted the ultra-Orthodox to be on board with that. What David Ben-Gurion committed was an exemption of 400 religious students from military service. But today, the number of ultra-Orthodox men who are eligible for military service is not 400. It is 50,000.
And the debate right now is hotter than ever because the country is in war.
Absolutely, and there are protesters that are taken to the streets on both counts. The senior commander of the Israeli army, who I interviewed, said today there's a distinction between blood and blood. He said that the seculars lose their sons, lose their daughters. He has neighbors who have fallen in the recent battles in the Gaza Strip, whereas young ultra-Orthodox men do not enlist into the army, do not go into the battlefields, and don't die in service.
And you went to one of these protests, and there were quite dramatic scenes. There's one man from the ultra-Orthodox community being dragged by the police. Tell us about the protesters you spoke to. What did they tell you?
So we hear very dramatic voices in these protests. On one hand, from the seculars, they say there's a distinction between blood and blood. And from ultra-Orthodox protesters, we've heard they'd rather die than go into the military. It's that dramatic. In their view, joining the military will directly impact their way of life. For example, the issue of men and women serving together. In ultra-Orthodox communities, there's clear separation between boys and girls in schools, between men and women in synagogues, in public schools. This is something that is very important to them. And this is something that puts their way of life, their view, in jeopardy.
As you mentioned, one of these protesters said he would rather die than to serve the military. That's quite extreme. Is the position of the ultra-Orthodox community pacifism or something else?
Now, in the view of many ultra-Orthodox men and women, they have a major contribution for the well-being of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. They believe that their prayers, several times a day, praying for the well-being, praying for the triumph of their nation, that is a key contribution for the safety, security, and well-being of the people who live in Israel.
You also interviewed a rabbi who is trying to be more pragmatic and practical, and he's proposed a sort of compromise model. Can you tell us about that a little as well?
So there's an understanding in certain ultra-Orthodox communities that the current situation cannot continue, that the burden needs to be shared more equally, and that is one of the things that the High Court has instructed the state to resolve. And the High Court has ruled that the current situation harms the principle of equality between ultra-Orthodox and the rest of those who are serving in the army. And one rabbi that I spoke to explained that in his view, there could be a pragmatic way to resolve the issue by enabling the ultra-Orthodox men to serve in certain units where the requirements in regards to separation between men and women and the other aspects of their daily community lives are respected by the army. The problem starts in other units. In most branches of the Israeli army, there is communal work between men and women. So it is important from the military's perspective to allow the ultra-Orthodox soldiers to serve in the army while, of course, protecting the principle of equality that has been, over the past decades, even enhanced for female soldiers.
They cannot even listen to a woman's voice on the intercom, from what I understand.
So female singing is one of the things that has been at the heart of the public dispute. And in a few cases, women were asked to stop singing in public ceremonies because of this is something that angered, obviously, the women's organizations and the liberal Israelis alike.
It reminds me a little bit of Iran and the ban on women singing.
So one thing that is very similar, since 1948, throughout the past few decades, leading into today, is the political conditions that always required some cooperation by the ultra-Orthodox communities. And even today, they're part of the government. In some cases, were kingmakers over the years, and we can still see how the political impact is significant on the Israeli political system.
And Michael, currently this military exemption is set to expire at the end of the month. Do we have any indications as to what is going to happen next?
So in 2012, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that the exemption for ultra-Orthodox men was non-constitutional for the simple reason that it was undermining the principle of equality between ultra-Orthodox Jews and those who are not. They demanded that the state would promote legislation that will prevent the wide exemptions that were accustomed until then. Since then, there have been several attempts by the governments, but up until now, none of them met the criteria that the Supreme Court has set. A couple of weeks ago, we've seen in another court session the justices instructing the state to once again set some sort of legislative solution to this issue. But I must say, we have seen politicians over and over again trying to take advantage of legal loopholes in order to prevent the drafting of ultra-Orthodox men. We are likely to see that again for the fundamental reason that the current government holds a few ultra-Orthodox ministers who are key players and have significant political impact.
But do you think that because the country is in the middle of a war, it could have some sort of impact on this decision?
I see more and more ultra-Orthodox communities that are open to serve the country in various ways. And I think that the challenge here is to find a way that will not contradict their beliefs. So one of the key roles that ultra-Orthodox men played after the 7th of October attack in communities around the Gaza Strip was to gather and identify bodies of victims. And that is something that obviously is very difficult for anyone to do, but it's a major contribution to the national security.
Because in your report you talked to that lieutenant colonel and he said that our boys are going to the front line and coming back in body bags.
People in Israel that are not ultra-Orthodox want them to share the burden of service. And when men serve for 3 years in the military and women serve for 2, and ultra-Orthodox men and women do nothing at all, that upsets those who send their boys and girls to the army. What they can do is start off by contributing in services that are related to welfare, hospitals, but it's not going to be enough in the long run. People expect them to also share the burden in the army. The officers that we spoke to, those who served in the army, who lost friends, who lost their sons and daughters in the Gaza Strip, they expect the ultra-Orthodox community to share that load as well.
BBC Arabic's Michael Cheval. And now to an intriguing story about a warehouse full of unwanted hats going up for sale in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. They are called ushankas and became famous as the warm furry hat popularized during the Soviet era. Here is BBC Ukrainian's Dmitry Vlasov.
Ushanka is a very warm hat made from the fur of rabbits, foxes, raccoons, beavers, or it could be a synthetic one. The head is round and thick with flaps on the sides that can hang down or to be tied up when it's not so cold. The first has appeared during the Russian Revolution. It came both from the Central Asia, where it's known by the extreme cold and heat, and also from Finland, where it's also cold. And then this warm has just spread around the European part of the former Russian Empire and appeared a part of the Soviet army uniform and remained almost until the present days. There were some different ushankas for different purposes, but the most famous is the military one. In the video we made about these fur hats, we included the first Soviet leaders as Lenin and Trotsky, and even the last leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev. All one by one they had this sort of fur hats. It became a tradition, so if the leader is wearing this sort of hat, the others are following them. In civilian lives, many people wore these hats. They are very practical, they are warm. I remember my father and mom wearing this in the extreme cold. In the late 80s and the early 90s, fur was a symbol of prosperity. Such hats were in short supply and mostly made to order. And ushankas was an easy target for the gangsters. They were looking for such people and trying to rob them. Even the Ukrainian former president, Viktor Yanukovych, he was also famously convicted as a member of the gang who stole such a hat in 1967 and convicted for 4 years in jail. As for now, these hats were mostly worn by guards, by men in the rural areas, and they disappeared. I don't remember them in latest years, 10 years ago, Russian Federation started the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east of Ukraine. And in 2014, Ukraine started thinking about to cut off relations with Russia and to escape Russian and Soviet standards, screw heads, and move to the Western technologies, Western standardizations. As NATO standards had no full heads at all, there's a normal head with some fleece under. This is what the Ukrainian army decided to have in 2017. So finally, the government decided to sell these 40,000 screw heads. The cost of one head is about 10 euros, and nobody knows who might buy them. The institutions will not do that. The individuals are not really interested. In the previous years, foreign tourists bought them, but as for now, there are no tourists in the country and no interest to these heads at all. There are still warm heads like Ushankas, but they are quite modified. My mom presented me a few years ago. One is minus 15, one is 20. It's really useful, but it is a modern one. The Soviet symbol as Ushanka is unacceptable in Ukraine now, and if you wear things like that, people may misinterpret you and think that you are missing the Soviet times and you are an enemy to the modern Ukraine. So this sort of things like military Soviet Ushanka is unacceptable in the independent Ukraine now.
When a hat is more than just a hat, with BBC Ukrainian's Dmytro Vlasov. And now a story from Thailand, where the government recently announced new laws to ban cannabis for recreational use. It comes only 18 months after the country decriminalized it for non-medicinal use, a move which kickstarted huge investment in cannabis-related businesses from farming to shops. BBC Thai's Tosapol Trisa report has been following the story.
Thailand's previous government decriminalized cannabis in August 2022 by saying that cannabis product with less than 0.2% of THC, which is the substance that make you high, would not be considered narcotics. That was a historic moment for people who advocate for the use of cannabis for many years, and also for the people who had been using it underground for decades. The government also allowed people to grow cannabis at home, which is interesting sight, because the first day that the cannabis in Thailand was decriminalized, there's a lot of pictures posted online with people with a fully grown plant of cannabis. So it just suggests that people had been growing cannabis at home in secret all along.
So why is the government reversing this law? Were there any problems?
I would say it's a social pressure, because since the decriminalization of cannabis, there are daily reports about the misuse of cannabis, especially for recreational purposes, such as children got sick eating cannabis cookie accidentally, youths consume cannabis and hallucinated and harm people, and also cannabis shop opening up near school, and also a recent high-profile case. You know that recently we have a Coldplay concert in Bangkok, and there was a report that people saying that they saw people smoking weeds during the concert. So that's a big news in Thailand and had been a debated issue for the past few weeks. You know that these negative reports, especially related to children, put a pressure on the government, which now said they would pass the law banning recreational cannabis by the end of this year. But for the tourists, cannabis is a bonus. And they say that, coming to Thailand, they enjoy the beach, they enjoy the sun, enjoy the cultures, and they can smoke weed inside the hotel room and enjoy legal weed.
And Tosapol, of course, when it was decriminalized, a lot of people started growing it and selling it. You actually went and you talked to some growers near Bangkok. Tell us what they told you and how do they feel about this possible ban on their produce?
So I visit the province called Kanchanaburi, which is a huge agricultural and cultural provinces, which is about 120 minutes by car from Bangkok. This is also the province that grow cannabis the most in the country and in Asia. So I visited the biggest cannabis farm in Asia and talked about how the new law would impact that business. I saw 150 acres of cannabis farm, which is enormous, and mostly they grow cannabis indoor. And this guy, he is the owner of the farm. He said that he is able to produce about 3 tons of cannabis flowers per 2 months, which is a lot of money. And the owners also said that if the new law is passed by the end of this year, he could adapt to grow the medicinal cannabis instead, but it would affect the profit hugely because most of his customers come to purchase his cannabis flower to sell for recreational use. But for him, he already invested almost $1 billion in this farm already, so he would not give up that easily. But there is another farm that I was visiting. I was invited by the owners into this cannabis storage and was surrounded by about 300 kilograms of premium cannabis flower, which is a size that I haven't seen. So this guy owning the farm said that he has no experience in cannabis at all and had not used the cannabis, but he saw the business opportunities and he jumped into this bandwagon even though that he was in the marketing industry and not related to cannabis at all. He said that now he already invests a huge sum of money for the indoor planting duties. He's joking that he might change from growing cannabis to growing something like strawberry instead, which is less value product. But he will try to find the customers that will buy the cannabis from him for the medicinal use, but he has not have any plan at the moment.
And how much is this industry worth in Thailand?
It is estimated to worth about $1 billion for this year and project to be increased into $1.2 billion next year. So it's a lot of money involved in this business. There are actually 20,000 cannabis shops across the countries. So if this ban goes through, that would cause a lot of problem for this shop.
And also, is the industry lobbying the government, or is it just done and dusted? They can't do anything about it.
There is no official information confirming that there is a lobbying to the government involved, but the insiders industry would not back down that easily. They would try to come up with something, especially the definition of medicinal cannabis, which is not categorized and defined by the government yet. But I believe that with the market values of $1 billion per year, the government earn huge sum of tax from this cannabis shop. But the social pressure and its pledge during the election campaign forced them to go through with the recreational ban law. But we expect that the government would put a lot of incentive to develop the medicinal cannabis industry to replace the recreational cannabis industry instead.
And what about your audiences? What do they have to say about this reversal of law?
We know that the public majority is against the cannabis freedom. So as expected, our coverage met with sarcasm and opposition. Most of the comments said that these cannabis business should shut down a long time ago. But for the advocate of cannabis, they see the benefit of the plant, whether medicinal, helping them sleep better, reducing the pain for serious illness, and also for recreational experience so that they could enjoy the weed legally in the countries. But if the government passed the law, all of this will be gone.
BBC Thai's Sosapol Chasaripol speaking to me from Bangkok. We'll be back on the 5th floor after this break.
This is the BBC World Service asking if psychedelic drugs could help in the treatment of mental health conditions.
This is very common for people to stop me and say, wait a minute, you're the mushroom person.
Heidi helps run a clinic in Oregon where the use of psilocybin, the active ingredient in so-called magic mushrooms, is legal in therapeutic sessions.
There's a lot of people suffering now without really effective treatment.
conditions.
So there's a major need.
We'll be hearing about the benefits, but also the concerns that widening access to these drugs can have.
Psilocybin in America is what's called a Schedule 1 substance, the most highly restricted category of illegal drugs.
It's my job to keep people safe and keep people calm. It is very important that people do this with guides and do this in a safe place.
Magic mushrooms and mental health. Tuesday at 8:15 GMT.
Still to come on the 5th floor, as China's birth rate drops and the number of older people rises, a pension crisis is predicted for the 2050s.
To put into myself as an example, my son was born in the last 5 years, and when 2050 comes, my son's work will have to support 6 old guys, me and my wife and his 4 grandparents, and we will all be pensioners at that time.
More on that after the news.
BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. Donald Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence says he cannot in good conscience back his old boss's bid for the presidency. Mr. Pence said the decision was based on profound differences over policy. The UN humanitarian chief has warned that up to 5 million people in war-torn Sudan could face catastrophic hunger in the coming months. Martin Griffiths appealed for the parties to the conflict to urgently allow the delivery of aid. Germany, France and Poland have agreed to step up the provision of weapons to assist Ukraine in its battle against the Russian invasion. The German Chancellor said Ukraine's allies would supply Kiev with much-needed long-range artillery. The spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General has again warned that an Israeli ground operation in Rafah in Gaza would be a humanitarian catastrophe. Earlier, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he'd approved plans for a military assault on the city. More than 1 million displaced people are sheltering there. UN officials say increasing numbers of children in Haiti are going hungry as unrest continues. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said efforts to restore stability through a transitional council were progressing. Boeing has told airlines using its 787 Dreamliners to check the pilot's seats after a LATAM Airlines plane suddenly plunged, injuring more than 50 people. A flight attendant reportedly hit a switch on the pilot's seat, sending them into the controls. Some passengers were thrown against the ceiling. The start of a top-flight women's football match in Britain was delayed by 30 minutes after Arsenal turned up in the same white socks as the host Chelsea. The Gunners were forced to buy black socks from the Chelsea megastore and cover up the Blues logo with tape. Chelsea won 3-1 at Stamford Bridge. BBC News.
Estás escuchando The Fifth Floor con Farnak Hamidi. Descarga nuestro podcast en nuestro sitio web bbcworldservice.com, The Fifth Floor.
Thank you, Norberto Paredes from BBC Mundo, for ushering us back on the 5th floor. It's the program where we delve a little deeper into the stories that our language service journalists have been reporting for their audiences. I'm Farnak Hamidi, and a little later on the program we are heading to Bali, which this week celebrated Nyepi, a Hindu day of silence, where normal life grinds to a halt.
We got a chance to see the airport during Nyepi, and it's like empty. The airport is closed for the whole 24 hours. No planes coming in, no planes coming out. It's really, really silent. The philosophy of Nyepi Day or Day of Silence is to give the universe a chance to heal.
More